Delta is amused seeing Nelson's clones and furiously attacks two of them. She then dodges herself from a sword attack of the real Nelson, but also notices something off. Alpha and Delta feel the slime on them not acting too well and disappearing gradually. Nelson laughs, evilly telling them that the closer they are to the core of the sanctuary, the more their magic is drained and the more his power is increased. Hence, he lured them there. Delta, however, seems more excited than scared about this. Aurora is walking in a void and asks Sid what he has been doing. Sid tells her he is just noticing that this place has no sense of up or down. Why? She tells him not to look up or down. The scenario changes and the two fall into the same battlefield where Alpha and the rest passed by a while ago. There is Aurora's baby version crying again, so she takes Sid's sword, wanting to get rid of her crybaby past. Before she could launch the sword, the dead soldiers attacked her. Sid saves her in time, and Aurora mentions that the sanctuary seems to be rejecting them, which is why the dead bodies are trying to attack them like zombies. Sid asks what will happen if she dies there, but she simply would be sent back to the first room. Epsilon and the others are walking around a space when some weird, disfigured person tries to approach them. Epsilon tells them not to attack as the moment the person touches her, she disappears into nothing. Epsilon calls her a memory that reacted to the possessed ones. With the mention of this, the memory breaks, sending them to a library that shows the results of the lives of the possessed ones who weren't found by a savior like Shadow. The information they get from there is good enough to be taken back by the camera they created using Shadow's knowledge. Sid keeps killing the already dead ones while mocking Aurora for not being the best fighter without her magic. She calls him a gorilla because he's doing so fine without his magic. He tells her he has been working on bodybuilding ever since he was a kid. More dead ones start approaching them, making the situation tiresome for them. Aurora suggests the solution lying towards her little version sitting in the center of the ditch they are at. Sid moves ahead and kills the memory version of the kid after an apology. The two then transition into the center of the sanctuary, where a bunch of chains are tied along with a sword dug into a throne-like place. Nelson could not believe that Delta was still fighting with full fervor, as he thought her magic should have been drained by now. She keeps killing his clones, while Nelson mentions his lack of belief that Delta awakened herself with a technique that was lost years ago. Alpha mock questions if it was lost, as she is also perfectly fine and killing his clones. Nelson steps back, faking confidence and telling them he was prepared for this much resistance. He then makes more clones of himself and increases his strength up until his full potential, but his boosting chokes when Delta screams with a blasting aura of her power and creates a huge iron slab that is thrown directly at all the clones of Nelson, getting rid of them with a single attack. Sid asks Aurora what are they supposed to do here. She tells him that the core lies behind the chains that can only be cut down using the sword in front of him. Sid comes near the sword and mentions it, rejecting him. Nevertheless, he tries to pull the sword out, but a message appears mentioning only a direct descendant can do so. The two now have no other way of getting to the core, so they sit in there waiting for nothing to happen. Alexia, Rose, and Beta stand there blankly looking at Delta, violently dealing with Nelson. Alexia mentions Delta does not at all seem like she works for Shadow, as when she saw Shadow, he had sophisticated ways of fighting, while Delta is only exhibiting unbridled violence. Alexia does not seem to support this way of fighting, which is ironic coming from a woman who uses her sword just because she is mad at a classmate. Beta mentions Delta must be a token musclehead for the Shadow Garden. The place breaks away, bringing them back to where the statue of Olivier is situated. Nelson expresses his confusion on how they were so casual at killing numerous clones of his without much effort. Alpha walks towards him, mentioning he must know as a scientist that clones are no better than scarecrows if they cannot move freely and have their minds. Nelson backs away, hitting the base of Olivier's statue, and decides to summon her to fight the Shadow Garden. Olivier comes forth, making Nelson chuckle evilly, while Alpha finally sees Olivier with her own eyes. Before things could progress any further, Epsilon appears announcing that their investigation is complete, and they can leave any moment now. Alpha decides it's time for them to leave, as they have no interest in fighting on certain memories. Their sole aim is to cut off the power supply for the cult. Now that they know how the defenses of the sanctuary work, Alpha wickedly announces to visit Nelson again, knowing damn well he cannot just casually face them outside even if he wants to. Delta glares at Nelson in anger, but one certain call from Alpha, and she cowers in fear and follows her like a scared cat. Beta and the princesses leave only after Beta's snarky remark of wanting to leave Alexia there. After they all leave, Nelson seems to want Alpha's blood so he can perfect the beads even further. As he devises a plan to make himself a hero in front of the cult, he is reported about intruders in the center of the sanctuary. He takes Olivier with him to the center. Sid talks to Aurora about her wanting to disappear after they are done with some games of tic-tac-toe. Aurora calls it setting herself free, as once the core is destroyed, she will be free from the infinite loop of memories repeating themselves. Sid is excited to see the protagonist of the story appearing who can draw the sword, but is disappointed upon seeing a bald villain appearing there. Sid notices the similarity between Olivier and Alpha, after which he and Aurora gossip about bald Nelson, as if he isn't right in front of them. Nelson calls him stupid for risking his life by getting into a witch's trap to come down there and orders Olivier to kill him. Aurora seems to be scared of Olivier for some reason, and tries to stop Sid, but he has already moved forward and is currently being beaten up by Olivier. He stands up, smiling after a good beating, frustrating Nelson for his content attitude. Sid calls it boring to fight someone with no heart and mind of her own to speak to. Aurora, with her weak memories, feels Olivier is undefeatable, and tries to form a deal to work with Nelson if he lets Sid go. Sid does not want her to do so, as he can survive on his own. The two get into a banter till Nelson frustratedly orders Olivier to kill Sid. Olivier takes a second to stab Sid, but Sid suddenly opens his eyes with a sword through his chest, mentioning Olivier falling into his bait. In the wildest of moves, while being stabbed by Olivier, Sid uses this chance to pull her off her sword, capture her, and bite her in the neck hard enough to actually rip off flesh from there. Olivier disappears with the memory being killed off. Nelson cannot believe his eyes, so Sid tells him he just protected his arteries and vital organs when he was stabbed. He walks towards Nelson, questioning if he is next in the fight, but Nelson starts babbling about giving up only for it to be a mockery. Nelson reminds Sid that he just killed a mere fragment of the memory of Olivier, and he can make thousands of those. With that cue, thousands of copies of Olivier actually appear and launch themselves at Sid. What Nelson did not bother noticing in all this was the unamused face of Sid. The moment Olivier's reaches him, he opens the eyes that he has had closed since he has been wandering in the sanctuary and uses a slime sword to cut down some of them. Nelson is once again in disbelief at how Sid managed to use magic. Sid tells him he was told that the sanctuary absorbs magic if tried to use, so he decided to contain his magic until it's solid enough to not be absorbed anymore. So this whole time when Sid had his one eye randomly closed, he was actually containing the magic within. Even Aurora is shocked at how simple Sid makes it sound. Tired of prolonging his visit, he decides to shorten the steps to destroy the core. Instead of getting the sword, cutting the chains, and destroying the core, he prefers blasting it all at once. The power he next exhibits is surprising for even a witch who masters in magic. When one of the Oliviers stabs his heart, he announces himself as the all-range atomic, blasting in the same way as he did before. The princess and Beta observe the huge amount of explosions within the waters. Sid witnesses the core of the sanctuary, but then wakes up seeing Aurora look down at him in worry. Aurora is confused at his surviving a stab through the heart. Sid clarifies he is extra tired because he moved his heart to save it from being stabbed. Aurora is a representation of us when she calls Sid full of surprises. Before she could say much, the two noticed she was fading away. She tells him she always wanted to fade into nothing, but the memory he gave her was something she'd like to remember forever. She apologizes for misleading Sid into the sanctuary and lying to him, and mentions lying about another thing too. She then proceeds to say something about whether Sid ever finds her real self, but before she can complete it, she vanishes into the air. Sid walks away casually as if it didn't bother him at all. Rose mentions the atomic attack of Sid being what they saw back there, but stops upon seeing Alexia lost in thoughts. Alexia feels a little frustrated that they are powerless enough to not be able to do anything as more and more complicated scenarios unfold in front of them. They can't even tell who is right and who is wrong and what the agenda of any of these groups is. Beta asks what she is planning on doing then. Alexia mentions that the three of them can use their respective connections to gather information about the situation, and maybe they can join some forces or make some allies to fight back later on. Beta calls the second part of her plan a weak plan, but Alexia thinks they need to start from somewhere and should not just sit idly observing chaos unfold right in front of their eyes. Alpha is reported about everything vanishing from the sanctuary, and she finds an ideal solution to the matter. She is then told about Beta guiding the princesses, which could get them to infiltrate the inner circles. Lastly, a surprising piece of information is that Aurora was also known by another name, the Demon Diablos. Epsilon asks if this needs to be reported to Shadow, but Alpha tells her he already knows everything. Luna is almost begged by a businessman to start her store on their land and keeps praising her store, but she is just sitting there doubting him and the land that is being offered. Nu approaches Luna and informs them that the survey is complete and things will work, and the liquid in question is indeed petroleum. With this, Luna does not bother listening to any more blabbering and tells him she'll work with him. As Alpha is passing by a room, she sees all her fellows peacefully engrossed in their hobbies, making Alpha recall the time when she made their first base after recruiting them all. Sid called it nice for how the story should progress while agreeing to teach them fighting techniques, which Alpha thinks are for the cult, while Sid was going to do this for the self-defense of a bunch of kids living unsupervised. She is brought out of her thoughts when informed that Vice Chancellor Perv Asshat, a crazy name, is set to visit the royal capital of Midgar Kingdom. In a sauna, Alexia informs Iris about both the murdered bishop and acting bishop being a part of the cult and the rest of the evidence being covered up. She tells Iris that a very strong influence is required for such a huge matter to be suppressed, and that the divine teachings need to be questioned as the first thing. Iris understands that, but their father is not ready to ruin relations with the church. They need to find some strong evidence to convince their father or show him they are fully capable of protecting the kingdom. She mentions the Bushin festival approaching, the win of which can be convincing for their father. Alexia mentions the situation being risky as Shadow Garden, or the cult can infiltrate this event too, like they did in the past. Iris is unbothered and ready to use her sword if any of them tries to come in her way. She then asks Alexia why she was risking herself to pry into the sanctuary matter. Alexia ruses off, not wanting to tell her she was doing it all just for her own curiosity. Rose is practicing fencing outside when she suddenly feels a sharp pain in her chest, with a red mark appearing there out of nowhere.